Clara's hand came down hard across her sister's face right there in the hallway. In front of the servants, in front of God, and anyone else who happened to be watching. "You are an embarrassment," Clara said. 31 years old and still living off my husband's patience. Nobody is coming for you, Margaret. Nobody has ever been coming for you. Margaret did not raise her hand to her cheek. She did not step back. She stood exactly where she was and looked her sister dead in the eyes. If this story moves you, subscribe, follow until the very end. And tell us what city you're watching from. The summer of 1814 settled over Harlowe County. Virginia like a wool blanket nobody asked for, thick, close, and impossible to shake off. The kind of heat that made people irritable and honest in equal measure. That stripped away the polite varnish folks liked to wear on top of their real feelings and left the ugly truth sitting right there in the open for anyone with eyes to see. Margaret Elaine Calloway was 31 years old. And she had been hearing the truth about herself her whole life. Not the real truth, the one people had decided on for her. The one that said a woman unmarried at 31 was a woman who had failed at the only thing that mattered. She heard it in the way Mrs. Dobbins at the dry goods store let her eyes travel up and down Margaret's dress before settling into that particular tight-lipped smile, the one that was not really a smile at all, but a verdict dressed up in politeness. She heard it in the way her younger sister Clara laughed too loudly at parties. Laughed the way people laugh when they want everyone in the room to look at them and not at the person standing beside them. She heard it from her father's old friends when they came to call. The ones who shook their heads just slightly when they thought she wasn't watching. The ones who dropped their voices when they talked about her, like she was a problem that had never quite been solved. And she heard it most clearly on the morning of the Whitfield summer gathering, when she was standing in the narrow hall outside her sister Clara's bedroom door, and Clara did not know she was there. "She is 31, Edmund," Clara was saying. Her voice carried easily through the thin wood. Bright and certain as a bell. 31 and not a single serious offer. Not one. Do you know what people say about her? Margaret heard her brother-in-law Edmund make a low sound, not agreement, not disagreement. Just the sound a man makes when he has learned that the safest position in an argument with his wife is no position at all. They say she must have something wrong with her, Clara continued. That a woman still unmarried at that age, there has to be a reason. And honestly, Edmund, I cannot say they are wrong. She is too quiet. I don't know too much. Men do not want a woman who makes them feel like she is always thinking 3 steps ahead of them. Clara, I am not being cruel. I am being honest. Mama would have wanted us to find a solution for her. She cannot live in this house forever. She cannot be my responsibility forever. I have my own children to think about, my own life. It is not my fault that she never made herself more. Clara stopped. Searched for the word, Edmund asked. More agreeable, Clara said finally. More easy. More the kind of woman a man actually wants. Margaret stood in that hallway for a long moment after Clara's voice moved on to other subjects, the guest list. The dress she planned to wear. Whether the Whitfield family had invited the Hargrove cousins from Charlottesville. She stood there and she breathed. She had learned how to breathe through things like this. She had been practicing for a long time. Then she straightened her spine. Smoothed the front of her dress, the blue one she had let out in the waist last spring, and taken in again at the shoulders, because the fabric was still good, and there was no sense in waste, and she went downstairs to help Clara's housekeeper prepare the baskets of food they would bring to the gathering. Because that was what Margaret did. She helped. She prepared. She managed the things that needed managing, while other people arranged themselves prettily and waited to be admired. She did not think about what Clara had said, or she tried not to. The Whitfield property sat 3 miles outside Harlowe County's small center, and the Whitfield family had been holding their summer gathering every July for going on 20 years. It was the kind of event that everyone in the county attended, because not attending was a statement nobody wanted to make. an absence that would be noted and discussed and assigned meaning whether meaning was intended or not. Margaret rode out with Clara and Edmund in their carriage. The three children packed in beside her little Thomas on her lap. The twins pressed against her sides, all of them asking questions. She answered patiently and steadily, while Clara touched the curls at her temples and studied her own reflection in the small traveling mirror she kept in her reticule. "You look fine," Margaret told her sister without being asked. "Do I?" Clara turned from the mirror. Her eyes moved over Margaret's dress with that particular swift assessment that sisters learn early and never quite abandon. "You should have worn the green. I told you the green was more flattering. The green needs mending at the hem. Then you should have mended it." "I was mending your yellow dress," Margaret said. Clara turned back to her mirror. Edmund looked out the window. Thomas patted Margaret's cheek with one small sticky hand, and she pressed a kiss to his forehead, and that was enough. That was what she held on to when everything else felt like it was pressing in from all sides, the weight of a child who trusted her. The simple animal warmth of someone who needed her and was not ashamed to show it. She could do this. She had done it before. She could walk into a room full of people who had already decided what she was and carry herself like a woman who had not yet gotten the message. The gathering was already well underway when they arrived. The Whitfield lawn stretched broad and green under the July sky, dotted with clusters of people in their summer clothes, servants moving between them with trays of cold lemonade and small plates of food. Someone had set up chairs in the shade of the old oak trees that lined the south end of the property, and the older women of the county had claimed those chairs like territory, their fans moving in slow, identical arcs as they watched everything and everyone with the focused attention of women who had decided that observation was the most interesting occupation left to them. Margaret helped Thomas down from the carriage, took the twins by their hands until they spotted other children and pulled free. And then she was standing on her own at the edge of the lawn with a plate of food she had helped prepare and no particular place to be. Clara had already found her friends. She was laughing at something one of them had said. Her hand on the arm of Mrs. Hensley, her head tilted just so the picture of a woman perfectly at home in the world she inhabited. Margaret watched her for a moment. Then she found a spot near the refreshment table that was not in anyone's way and not so isolated that it announced itself as isolation. And she stood there, and she watched the county go about its summer business. She was good at watching. She had noticed things about people for as long as she could remember the way Mr. Whitfield's smile never quite reached his left eye when he greeted certain guests. The way the Hensley daughters looked at each other across a crowd when they wanted to communicate something they did not want their mother to hear. The way men arranged themselves around power without ever appearing to do so deliberately. Like iron filings settling toward a magnet, she noticed. This afternoon, a man she had not seen before. He arrived the way people with real authority always arrive without announcement. Without particular ceremony, but with the kind of presence that reorganized a room even when the room was outdoors. He was taller than most men in the county, broad through the shoulders. And he moved with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who had decided long ago that he was not in a hurry for anyone. He was perhaps 38-40. His face was weathered in a way that had nothing to do with carelessness and everything to do with a life lived largely outdoors and without apology. He wore dark clothes despite the heat, and he wore them well. And he did not look at anyone in particular as he crossed the lawn toward his host, and yet Margaret had the distinct, strange impression that he had seen everything there was to see before he had taken 3 steps onto the property. She watched him greet Thomas Whitfield with a handshake, not the elaborate social bow that some men deployed like a weapon. Just a handshake, firm and brief. She watched Thomas Whitfield, who was not a man easily impressed, straighten slightly. The way people straighten when they are in the presence of someone they want to appear well to. She did not ask anyone who he was. She turned back to the refreshment table and poured herself a small glass of lemonade. And then she heard Clara's voice, raised just slightly above the ambient noise of the gathering, carrying with perfect clarity across the 15 feet of open air between them. "Oh, she has always been like this," Clara was saying. Standing apart watching. She was the same way as a girl. Mama used to say she did not know what to do with her. And honestly, a small laugh Brighton practiced. "I still don't. 31 years old, not married. What is she waiting for? What does she think is going to happen for her at this point?" The women around Clara laughed. Some softly, some more freely, the way people laugh when someone says the thing they have all been thinking and have been too polite to say aloud. Margaret did not move. She held her glass of lemonade in both hands, and she looked straight ahead, and she breathed. "Margaret." Clara's voice sharpened suddenly, shifted register. She had spotted her sister standing there, had realized. Perhaps that sound carried differently outdoors than she had calculated. For just a second, something crossed her face that might have been discomfort, but it passed quickly, replaced by the bright social certainty that Clara wore like a second skin. "Come join us. We were just I heard," Margaret said. The word landed cleanly, not tearful, just precise. Clara's chin lifted. I know what you were doing," Margaret said. "And I know why." The women around Clara went still. This was not how things usually went. Usually when Clara spoke about her sister in these particular tones, her sister was not present to respond. Or if she was present, she smiled and deflected and made it easy for everyone involved. Margaret did not feel like making it easy today. "I am 31 years old," she said. And her voice was level and clear and carried its own kind of weight that had nothing to do with volume. "I am standing here because I was invited, same as everyone else. And I am standing here alone because I choose to stand alone rather than to stand in a circle and talk about people who are not here to answer for themselves." She put her glass of lemonade down on the table. "That is what I am waiting for, Clara," she said. "That is what I have always been waiting for. To stand in a place and be exactly who I am without apologizing for it." She turned away before anyone could answer. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were perfectly steady. She walked toward the far edge of the lawn, toward the old fence that separated the Whitfield property from the open field beyond it. And she walked like a woman who had somewhere to be. She did not hear him approach. She had her hands on the top rail of the old wooden fence, and she was looking out at the field, the tall grass moving in the faint summer breeze, the tree line dark and distant against the pale afternoon sky, and she was working on breathing evenly, on getting her heart back down to its regular pace, on convincing herself that what she had just done was not going to cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. That took courage. The voice came from her right, and it was low and unhurried, and did not sound like it was offering a compliment so much as stating a fact. She turned. It was the man she had noticed crossing the lawn. He was standing a few feet away, and he was not looking at her with the particular expression she had expected, the one that combined pity with curiosity that people usually deployed when they approached her. He was looking at her straight on, and his expression was, she struggled for the word clear. Like he had no agenda in the looking, like he was simply seeing what was there. "I beg your pardon," she said. "What you said back there," he said. "To your sister." He paused. That took courage. "I don't know that it was courage," Margaret said. "I think I was simply tired." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than a smile. "Sometimes those are the same thing," he said. She studied him for a moment. "You were close enough to hear. I was. And you are not going to tell me that it was imprudent, that I should have held my tongue, that a woman in my position cannot afford." "No," he said simply. She looked at him. "My name is Callum Ashworth," he said. And he removed his hat and held it in both hands the way men used to do. The old way, the way that meant something. "I own land about 12 miles east of here, along the river." She knew the name. Everyone in Harlowe County knew the name Ashworth, knew it the way you know the name of a mountain. as something large and fixed that defines the landscape around it. The Ashworth land had been in his family for 2 generations. And under Callum Ashworth's management, it had doubled in size and trebled in value. He was spoken of in the county in tones that varied between respect and wariness, depending on who was doing the speaking. She had never seen him at a gathering before. "Margaret Calloway," she said. And she did not extend her hand, because ladies did not extend their hands to gentlemen they had not been properly introduced to. And old habits were old habits regardless of how the rest of the afternoon had gone. "Miss Calloway," he said. He put his hat back on. "Did you mean it?" "What you said." She frowned. "Which part?" "The part about standing in a place and being exactly who you are without apologizing for it." He said it without mockery, without softness. Just the question, direct and plain. "Or was that something you said in the heat of the moment, and you'll spend the rest of the afternoon regretting?" The question surprised her enough that the honest answer came out before the careful one could catch up. "Both," she said. "I meant it, and I will probably regret it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Reckon, that's about the most honest thing I've heard at one of these gatherings in years," he said. She did not speak with him again that afternoon. He moved through the gathering the way he had arrived with that contained deliberate quality, stopping to speak with men she recognized as landowners and merchants, nodding to the older women who watched him with particular interest, deflecting with brief courtesy the more elaborate attentions of several young women whose mothers had positioned them in his path with the transparent strategy of women who had done this kind of positioning before. Margaret watched him when she thought she was not being observed watching him. Clara found her again near the end of the afternoon, when the heat had begun to settle into the particular golden thickness of late July, and people were starting to make their farewells. "That was unnecessary," Clara said. Her voice was quiet now, stripped of its earlier brightness. "What you said." "In front of everyone." "You said something in front of everyone first," Margaret said. "I was not." Clara stopped, smoothed the front of her dress. "I was not trying to hurt you." "I know," Margaret said. And she did know. That was the particular cruelty of it that Clara never intended hurt. That she spoke the things she spoke with the breezy, unconscious confidence of a woman who had never had to think too carefully about the weight of her words. Because her words had never been aimed at her. "But you did." Clara looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes that was genuine, something that was not the social performance. Not the bright certainty. "What do you want, Margaret?" she asked. And for once her voice was plain and without decoration. "What is it that you actually want?" "Because I do not know. I have never known, and I want you to have it. Whatever it is. She stopped. "I do not understand you." "I have never understood you." Margaret looked at her sister. Her younger sister, who was beautiful and easy, and had been the kind of woman the world wanted from the first moment she had understood what the world wanted. "I know," she said again. "I know you don't." She said it without bitterness. It was just the truth. It was just the way things were. Clara nodded once, and then she went to collect her children and find Edmund. And Margaret stood where she was for another moment, watching the last of the afternoon light stretch long across the Whitfield lawn. She thought about Callum Ashworth on the ride home. She had not intended to. She tried methodically and without drama to simply not think about him, to file the conversation away as the sort of strange small encounter that happened occasionally in life. That meant nothing. That would not repeat itself. But she kept returning to the way he had looked at her. Not with pity, not with the particular calculating assessment that men sometimes directed at a woman of her age and situation, the look that added up her liabilities and her assets and arrived at a verdict. Not even with the careful courtesy that well-meaning people deployed when they wanted to be kind without being honest. He had looked at her like she was a person, like she was a whole and complete person standing in front of him. And he was simply interested in that person, and no apology was required from either of them. She had not been looked at that way in a very long time. She looked down at Thomas, asleep against her side in the carriage. His small mouth slightly open, one hand fisted in the fabric of her dress. She thought about what Clara had asked. "What do you want?" "Margaret, what is it that you actually want?" It was, she realized, a question she had stopped asking herself. At some point she could not have said when she had set the question aside, filed it with other questions that had no productive answers, and gotten on with the business of being useful. But it was still there. The question was still there, waiting with the particular patience of things that cannot be permanently buried. She pressed her lips together, and she looked out at the dark countryside, passing by the carriage window. And she let herself, quietly and without drama, want something she could not yet name. The next morning brought the particular clarity that follows a restless night, everything sharp-edged, and a little too bright. Her thoughts precise and her patience thinner than usual. She was in the kitchen when Clara found her, helping Mrs. Porter prepare the morning meal, her sleeves rolled up, and her hands already dusty with flour. "A note came for you," Clara said. She was holding it out with an expression Margaret could not quite read, not quite surprise, not quite alarm. Something between the two. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and took the note. It was written on heavy paper, in a hand that was direct and unadorned, no flourishes, no elaborate courtesies. "Miss Calloway, my housekeeper informs me that the Calloway family he holds northeast grazing land adjacent to my river property land that was your mother's family's, before it became your father's. I understand there may be some disagreement about the survey lines, and I would prefer to settle the matter plainly, and without involving lawyers or the county. If that is agreeable to you, I will be in Harlowe on Thursday. If you are willing to meet, name the place and time. Callum Ashworth PSI do not make a habit of writing to unmarried women without the knowledge of their family. If you prefer that I address this through your brother-in-law, I will do so. But my impression of you yesterday was that you prefer things to be addressed directly. Tell me if I am wrong." Margaret read the note twice. Then she read it a third time. She was aware of Clara watching her, waiting. "Well," Clara said. Margaret folded the note and held it against her chest for a moment. "It's about the land," she said. "The northeast parcel. He says there's a survey dispute. Callum Ashworth is writing to you about a land dispute." Clara's voice had climbed slightly, had taken on that particular pitch of someone trying to process two things at once. "He is." Margaret looked at her sister. "He says he prefers to settle it directly. Without lawyers. He wrote to you. He wrote to me." Clara stared at her. "He looked at you," she said slowly. "Yesterday, I noticed. He watched you after what happened. It's a land matter." "Clara, it is a land matter," Margaret said again, quietly and with finality, "and I am going to reply." She turned back to the bread she had been preparing, her hands moving again with that steady, familiar rhythm. Behind her, she could feel her sister standing still in the kitchen doorway, trying to fit this morning into the same shape as yesterday, trying to make it make sense within the story she had always told about her older sister, the woman nobody was coming for, the woman who waited and was not chosen, the woman the world had set aside. That story, Margaret thought, pressing her palms into the dough, had never been quite accurate. She had never been waiting to be chosen. She had been waiting for something worth choosing. And maybe, just maybe, the shape of what that might look like had begun, however faintly and without her permission, to clarify itself. She pressed the dough down, and the kitchen was warm. And outside the Virginia summer was already burning itself bright. She had a letter to write. The letter Margaret sent to Callum Ashworth was 7 sentences long. She had written 4 drafts before settling on 7 sentences. The first draft had been too formal, stiff, and careful, in the way of a woman who was afraid of being misread. The second had overcorrected into something that felt almost casual. And casual was not a tone she could afford with a man she did not know. The third, she had thrown into the kitchen fire, because somewhere in the middle of it, she had started explaining herself. And she had learned long ago that explaining yourself to people who had not asked for an explanation was a form of apology. And she was done apologizing. The seventh sentence read, "I prefer things addressed directly, and you are not wrong." She sent it with the Whitfield family's courier, who was making his Thursday rounds through the county. And then she went about her morning as though she had not just done something that would give Clara material for conversation for the next 3 weeks. Clara found out by noon. "You wrote back to him," she said. She was standing in the doorway of the sitting room, and her voice had that particular careful quality of a woman who was trying very hard to sound neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "You wrote back to Callum Ashworth without consulting Edmund. The land belonged to my mother's family before it became my father's," Margaret said, without looking up from the mending in her lap. "It is therefore a matter that concerns me directly. I did not require Edmund's consultation. He is the head of this household. He is your husband," Margaret said. "He is not mine." Silence. Clesh crossed the room and sat down across from her sister with the deliberate care of a woman assembling her arguments. "Margaret, you do not know anything about Callum Ashworth. I know he owns 12 miles of river property and he settles disputes without lawyers," Margaret said. "That tells me more about a man than most introductions do. People say he is difficult. People say I am difficult. That is different, is it?" She looked up then, and held her sister's gaze with a steadiness that Clara had never quite learned how to answer. "Or is it that when a man is difficult, people call him exacting? And when a woman is difficult, they call her a problem?" Clara opened her mouth, closed it. "Just be careful," she said finally, and the sharpness had gone out of her voice, replaced by something that might, under different circumstances, have been called worry. "That is all I am saying. Just be careful." Margaret looked at her sister, really looked at her, in the way she sometimes allowed herself to do, when Clara's guard slipped enough to show the person underneath the performance. "I am always careful," she said quietly. "I have been careful my entire life. And I am still standing in your sitting room doing your mending." She looked back down at the needle and thread in her hands. After a moment, she heard Clara rise and leave the room. Callum Ashworth arrived in Harlowe on Thursday at 10:30 in the morning, which was exactly when he had said he would arrive. And Margaret noted this with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had spent too many years surrounded by people who treated time as a suggestion rather than a commitment. She met him at the edge of the Calloway family's northeast parcel, the stretch of land that ran along the creek bed where the old survey markers had been set decades ago and had since been disputed by 3 separate landowners, including most recently the Ashworth estate. She had walked the property line herself the day before, methodically, with the old survey documents her father had kept in a cedar box under his bed. And she had arrived at conclusions that she was prepared to defend. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the creek's edge with his hat in his hands, looking at the old boundary stone that had been the subject of the dispute. He turned when he heard her approach, and he did what very few men in Harlowe County had ever done when Margaret Calloway walked toward them in a purposeful straight line with documents tucked under her arm. He waited. He did not step forward to take the documents from her. He did not arrange his face into the expression of patient, slightly condescending attention that men usually wore when women attempted to discuss property matters with them. He simply waited and watched her come, and when she was close enough to speak, without raising her voice, he said, "You found the old stone." "I found the old stone," she confirmed. "And I found my father's survey records from 1798. Which placed the boundary line 4 feet east of where your estate's current records have it." He was quiet for a moment. "My records were drawn from the 1806 survey. The 1806 survey was conducted by Elias Pruett," Margaret said, "who at the time of the survey was carrying a debt to your family's estate of approximately $200. I have the ledger record." She held up the documents. I am not suggesting fraud. I am suggesting that a man who owes $200 to the person whose land he is surveying may not be the most objective instrument of measurement. Callum Ashworth looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not offense and was not amusement. Exactly, but was somewhere in the territory between the two, the look of a man who had been handed something unexpected and was deciding in real time what to do with it. You did your research, he said. I did my research, she agreed. When? Tuesday and Wednesday. In 2 days, I read quickly, she said. And I had motivation. This land has been in my mother's family for 40 years. I will not lose it to a surveyor's convenient arithmetic. He was quiet again. He looked at the boundary stone for a long moment. And then he looked back at her, and his expression had settled into something. She could not fully read something that was serious and focused in a way that was not threatening. Just present, fully, entirely present in the way of a man who had decided that this moment deserved his complete attention. You're right, he said. She blinked. I beg your pardon? The 1798 survey is the valid one. I had my doubts about Pruitt's measurements when I reviewed them last fall. But I did not pursue it because the discrepancy was small and my land manager told me it was not worth the trouble. He paused. He was wrong. And so was I for listening to him without looking further. Margaret stared at him. In her experience, men did not say that. Men said, let us look into this further, and I will have my people review the documents and have perhaps a compromise, all of which were different ways of saying, I am not going to admit you are right while we are standing here, and I would like to delay this until you are tired of fighting it. Men did not stand at a creek's edge in the July heat and say you're right with the simple directness of someone who had evaluated the evidence and arrived at a conclusion and saw no reason to dress that conclusion up in anything other than plain language. That is, she started, he said. I was going to say fair, she said. Reckon, they're not always the same thing, he said. But I'd rather they were. He looked down at the documents she was still holding. And then he said, will you walk the line with me? I'd like to understand the full extent of the discrepancy before I have my surveyor come back out. She considered him for a moment. Yes, she said. All right. They walked the property line together for the better part of an hour. And he asked questions that were good questions, questions that told her he actually understood land management. That he was not asking in order to perform interest, but because he was genuinely working through the problem. And she answered him directly and completely, without softening her conclusions or deferring to his greater experience, or doing any of the dozen small diminishments in order to make men comfortable enough to keep listening. He kept listening. It was, she thought, one of the stranger experiences of her adult life. They had reached the far end of the parcel, where the creek bent sharply north, when he said, without preamble, how long have you been managing your family's land matters? She paused. Since my father's health declined, 3 years. Before that, I helped him with the records from the time I was 16. He did not have sons who were interested. She said it flatly, without self-pity. My brother went to Richmond. My sister married. Someone had to understand the land. And you were the one who stayed. I was the one who stayed. He was quiet for a moment. And she had the sense that he was not simply waiting for her to stop talking, but was actually sitting with what she had said, turning it over, considering its weight. That kind of work goes unnoticed, he said finally. Most work that actually holds things together does, she said. He looked at her sideways. Does it bother you? Being unnoticed, the question caught her off guard. Not because it was intrusive, it wasn't, the way he asked it. But because in her experience, men who wanted to know how a woman felt about her own life usually wanted to feel better about how they had treated her. They were not asking because they actually wanted the answer. She had the strange, unsettling sense that this man actually wanted the answer. It used to, she said carefully, when I was younger. I thought if I worked hard enough, was capable enough, someone would see it, would see me. She paused. Eventually, you stop expecting the recognition and you just do the work because the work matters. Because if you stop, something falls apart that should not fall apart. He didn't say anything immediately. When he did speak, it was quiet. I know something about that, he said. She looked at him. My first wife, he said, and then he stopped. And she saw something move across his face that was brief and controlled, but was undeniably pain. She was very good at being seen. Beautiful. Charming. Everyone in the county loved her. He paused. She did not love the land. She did not love what the land required. She loved what the land produced. The money. The position. Another pause. I thought it was enough to be chosen. Even if the choice was not entirely about me. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture. It wasn't enough, Margaret said. Not a question. No, he said. It wasn't. 4 years ago, he said. Fever. It was quick. He said it with the particular careful flatness of a man who had long since finished grieving and had arrived at the geography that comes after grief, not peace. Exactly, but a kind of settled reckoning. I don't say it to invite sympathy. I say it because you asked me a direct question about my land management practices, and I want you to understand why I let Pruett's survey sit unchallenged for 2 years. I had other things I was not looking at. She understood. She understood it in a way that went past the words. I am sorry, she said, not the pitying kind of sorry. The other kind. He looked at her directly. What's the other kind? The kind where you recognize that someone has been through something hard and come out the other side of it still standing. And you respect the standing. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched past the comfortable length of a gaze between two people who had just met a week ago at a summer gathering where one of them had been publicly humiliated by her sister. Then he said, I will have my surveyor correct the boundary records next week. You'll receive a written confirmation. Thank you, she said. No, he said simply. Thank you for not letting it go. She did not tell Clara about the conversation by the creek. She told Clara that the matter had been resolved in the family's favor, that Mr. Ashworth's surveyor would be correcting the records, and that there was no further cause for concern. Clara received this information with an expression that suggested she was very aware there was more to the story and was calculating, in real time, whether pressing the issue was worth the kind of response she might get. She decided wisely to let it rest. What Margaret did not say, and what she turned over in her mind during the long, quiet hours of that evening, was this, that she had spent an hour and a half walking a property line with a man who had treated her like an intelligent adult in full possession of her faculties, and that this experience was rarer than it should have been, and that she was annoyed at herself for noticing how rare it was, because noticing it meant admitting how much she had been starved of it. She did not want to be the kind of woman who was moved by simple basic decency. But simple basic decency she was discovering. Not so simple and not so common. She was sitting with this realization, and the particular discomfort of it, when Edmund came home from town on Friday evening with news that shifted everything. He came in through the front door with his hat still on and his coat not yet removed, which meant he was agitated. Edmund was a man of habit, and the disruption of his habits was always a signal. There's talk in town, he said, addressing Clara but looking at Margaret. Margaret set down her book. What kind of talk? Clara asked. About the Ashworth meeting, Edmund said. Someone saw them together at the northeast parcel. Someone saw. He stopped, looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who was genuinely uncomfortable with what he was about to say but felt the obligation of saying it. There is talk that it was not entirely a business meeting, that it was arranged, that Margaret said, and her voice was very quiet. Edmund cleared his throat. That she contrived the meeting, that she invented the survey dispute in order to have a reason to seek out a wealthy man's attention. The room was very still. That is not what happened, Margaret said. I know that, Edmund said. Do the people saying it know that? Edmund's silence was its own answer. Clara made a sound that was halfway between anger and despair. Who is saying this? Who started it? Mrs. Hensley's daughter, Edmund said. She was riding past the creek with her mother when he stopped again. When they saw them walking together, talking, and then she made it into something it was not, Margaret said. Yes, because Margaret said, and her voice was still quiet, still level, but there was something underneath it now. Something that was not quite anger but was in the same family as anger. Because a woman who has the audacity to conduct a legitimate business transaction with a wealthy man must have had an ulterior motive. Because what other reason could she possibly have for speaking to him? Margaret Clara started. Because God forbid a woman be taken seriously on the subject of her own property, Margaret said. God forbid she know what she is talking about and be treated accordingly, and there be absolutely nothing else to it. The talk will pass, Edmund said. He said it with the weary certainty of a man who had watched talk pass before and knew the shape of it. It will not pass before it does its damage, Margaret said. And she was right. The damage arrived the following Tuesday in the form of an invitation withdrawn. The Hargrove family had been planning a supper gathering for the following Saturday, and Margaret had received an invitation 3 weeks prior, a small, handwritten card on cream paper that she had accepted with the kind of quiet gratitude she was careful not to show too plainly. The Hargroves were good people, and their gatherings were attended by the kind of men and women whose opinions carried weight in the county. On Tuesday, a note arrived from Mrs. Hargrove. It was politely worded. It referenced a change in plans, a reduction in the number of guests, a family matter that required adjustment. It said nothing that could be directly quoted as unkind. But it withdrew the invitation. Clara read it over Margaret's shoulder and said nothing. For once, she said absolutely nothing, and that silence was worse than anything she could have said. Margaret folded the note and put it in her pocket and went to the kitchen to help Mrs. Porter with the bread. She worked for an hour without speaking, her hands moving through the familiar motions with the automatic steadiness of long practice, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, because if she felt the full weight of it, she would not be able to stand up straight under it. And she needed to stand up straight, because that was what you did. You stood up straight, and you kept going, and you did not give the people who were trying to diminish you the satisfaction of watching you diminish yourself. She was pulling the first loaf from the oven when she heard the knock at the front door. She heard Mrs. Porter answer it, heard the low murmur of exchange. And then Mrs. Porter appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression Margaret could not read. "There's a man at the door, Miss Calloway," she said. "Asking to speak with you. Who is it?" Mrs. Porter's expression shifted slightly. "Mr. Ashworth, ma'am." Margaret set the bread loaf down on the cooling rack. She removed her apron with the careful, unhurried movements of a woman who was not going to let anyone see that her heart had just done something complicated. She went to the door. He was standing on the front step, hat in hand, and his expression when he saw her was direct. Not apologetic, not uncertain, just direct, the way he always seemed to be when he was about to say something that he had already decided needed to be said. "I heard about the Hargrove invitation," he said. She looked at him. "Word travels quickly. In a small county it does." He paused. "I also heard what Mrs. Hensley's daughter has been saying, and I came to tell you that I intend to correct it," he said. "I am going to speak to several people in town today, people whose word carries weight, and I am going to tell them exactly what our meeting at the creek was, what it concerned, and what was resolved. I am going to make it plain that you conducted yourself with complete professionalism, and that the meeting was entirely my initiation." He paused. "I should have considered more carefully how it would appear. I did not think." "You did not think that people would assume the worst of me," Margaret said. "I did not think it through fully," he said. "That was my failure." "Not yours, and I intend to correct it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. He frowned. "Why does it matter to you?" "The talk will pass. You said yourself that the business is settled. You could simply let it pass. It does not affect you. He looked at her steadily. And when he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "It affects you," he said. "That's enough reason." The words landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there. She was a woman who had learned, across 31 years, to be skeptical of simple statements that sounded too good to be true. She had learned this the way you learn things that cost you, through the slow accumulation of evidence, through the particular education of being disappointed just enough times that you stopped giving your hope out carelessly. But she looked at him standing on her front step, with his hat in his hands, and his eyes steady and his voice carrying nothing but the plain weight of what he had said. And she thought, not with certainty, not with the reckless confidence of a woman who had not been paying attention, but with the careful, cautious, tentative quality of a woman who had been paying very close attention. Indeed, she thought that he meant it. Just that, simply that. He meant what he said. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. He put his hat back on. "I'll be in town by noon." By supper time, the story should have a different shape to it. He turned to leave. "Mr. Ashworth," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "The other kind." He was quiet for a moment, and then, for the first time in her acquaintance with him, he did something she had not expected. He smiled, not the social performance of a smile, the real kind, brief and quiet and a little unpracticed, like something he did not do often enough to be fluid at it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he left. He did what he said he would do. By Friday, the shape of the story in Harlowe County had changed. It had not been erased. Stories rarely were. They just got buried under other stories, but the version that was circulating now was closer to the truth. A legitimate land dispute, professionally resolved. Nothing further to remark upon. Mrs. Hargrove sent a second note. It did not re-extend the invitation, but it was warmer in its tone than the first, and it mentioned that she hoped to see Margaret at the coming month's gathering. And Margaret recognized this for what it was: a small signal, a cautious correction, a woman who had moved too quickly in one direction, feeling her way back toward center. She accepted the correction without comment, but the thing she could not so easily set aside was the visit itself, the fact of him standing on her doorstep, the fact that he had come and why. Clara had been in the upstairs hall when he arrived, and had heard enough to form a picture that she spent the better part of Friday trying to share with her sister in various conversational approaches, all of which Margaret deflected with the ease of long practice. Finally, on Friday evening, Clara abandoned subtlety entirely. "He likes you," she said, flat, direct, surprised by her own directness. "He corrected an injustice," Margaret said. "That is a different thing, Margaret." "Clara." "He came to your door," Clara said. "He did not write a letter. He did not send a representative. He came himself, to your door, and he told you he was going to fix it. And then he fixed it. Men who are simply correcting injustices send letters." Margaret was quiet. "He looked at you at the Whitfield gathering," Clara said. "I saw it. I did not say anything because I did not know what to make of it. But I saw it." She paused. "Margaret, when was the last time a man looked at you like that?" Margaret did not answer, because the answer was something she was not prepared to say aloud, that she could not remember. That she had been looked at in many ways over 31 years. And most of those ways had contained a verdict, and none of them had contained the simple, plain interested, seeing that she had encountered in a man she had known for a matter of 2 weeks. "Be careful with it," Clara said suddenly, not sharply, not with the performative concern of a woman managing her own anxiety. Just carefully, like she actually meant it, like she was trying, in the way of a sister who had not always been kind, to be kind now. "Whatever this is, just be careful with it. You deserve," she stopped. "You deserve someone who looks at you like he does." Just be careful." Margaret looked at her sister. For a moment, she was not the woman who had been publicly mocked and privately managed and systematically overlooked for 3 decades. She was just a woman, looking at her sister, and her sister was looking back at her with something genuine. "I know," Margaret said quietly. I'm trying. The second time Callum Ashworth came to the house, he did not come to correct anything. He came on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the creek meeting, with his hat in his hands, and a question he delivered with the same directness she had to recognize as simply the way he was built, no preamble. No social scaffolding, just the thing he had come to say. Said plainly. My Northfield manager retired last month, he said. I have been managing his records myself in the interim. And I am not a pause, a flicker of something that might have been self-deprecating amusement. I am not as organized as I would like to be. I have heard from Thomas Whitfield that you kept your father's land records with a precision that held up against a legal challenge. I am wondering if you would be willing to consult on the organization of my field records. Margaret looked at him. You are asking me to do work, she said. I am asking if you are willing to do work, he said. For fair compensation. I am not asking you to do it out of charity. On either side. She studied him for a moment. Most men in this county would consider it inappropriate to employ an unmarried woman in a consulting capacity. Most men in this county, he said, are losing money because their records are disorganized and they're too proud to admit it. She held his gaze. When would you need me to begin, she said. Something in his expression settled, not relief. Exactly, but the calm of a man who had hoped for a particular answer and received it. Whenever suits you, he said. I reckon there's no particular hurry. But the sooner the better. Wednesday, she said. I can be at your estate by 9. I'll have coffee ready, he said. He put his hat back on, said good afternoon, and left. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, after his horse had disappeared down the road. And she was aware, with the precise and uncomfortable clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life keeping accurate accounts, that something was shifting. Not dramatically, not with the sudden crash of things that happen all at once, but with the slow, inexorable quality of a tide coming in quietly, steadily in a direction she had not been expecting to face. She went back inside. Clara was waiting in the hall with the expression of a woman who had heard every word from behind a door she had not been trying very hard to be invisible behind. Margaret looked at her. Don't, she said. I wasn't going to say anything, Clara said. You were. I was going to say, Clara paused. I was going to say that the green dress is mended now. If you wanted to wear it Wednesday. Margaret blinked. Clara held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment, she was just her sister, not the woman who had spoken cruelty into a hallway and not known she was being heard. Not the woman who laughed too brightly at parties. Just her sister, standing in the hall in the Sunday afternoon light, trying in the only way she currently knew how to try. Thank you, Margaret said. You're welcome, Clara said. And they stood there in the hall together, and outside the Virginia summer was hot and bright and full of the particular possibility of things that had not yet been decided. She wore the green dress on Wednesday. She told herself it was simply because it was her best dress, and she was going to a professional engagement, and it was appropriate to dress accordingly. She told herself this with the firm, practiced conviction of a woman who has learned that the stories we tell ourselves about our own motivations are often the last line of defense against a truth we are not quite ready to face. Clara said nothing when she came downstairs. She just looked at her sister for a moment with that particular expression, the one that was not quite a smile, but contained the architecture of one, and handed her the leather satchel that held the survey documents and the family land records. Be back before dark, she said. I will, Margaret said. And Margaret she turned. Clara looked at her steadily. You look well, she just that. Nothing more. Margaret held her sister's gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that was too layered and too old to be named simply. And then she nodded and went out to where Edmund's man was waiting to drive her the 12 miles east to the Ashworth estate. The work was real work. That was the first thing she registered when Callum led her through to the room where his land records were kept, the sheer volume of it. The accumulated weight of years of transactions and surveys and harvest records and labor accounts that had been maintained with varying degrees of rigor by a succession of managers who each had their own system and none of whom had felt it. Necessary to reconcile their system with the one that came before. She stood in front of the shelves and looked at it all. And she felt the particular sensation she always felt when confronted with a large disordered problem, not overwhelm, but something closer to its opposite, a kind of focus. A narrowing of attention that was almost pleasurable in its clarity. "It's worse than I represented," Callum said from the doorway. "It's not so bad," she said. "You're being kind. I'm being accurate," she said, pulling out the first ledger and opening it on the table. "Disorganized is not the same as irreparable. Someone kept these records. They just did not keep them in a way that anyone else can follow." She ran her finger down the first column of figures. "Who was your manager before Pruitt?" "A man named Horatio Bell. He was here for 11 years. And before him? My father managed the records himself." She nodded slowly, already seeing the shape of it, 3 distinct systems layered on top of each other, like sedimentary rock. Each one internally coherent and externally incompatible with everything around it. It was a documentation problem, which meant it was a pattern problem, which meant it was exactly the kind of problem she was best equipped to solve. "I'll need 4 days," she said. "Possibly 5 if the harvest records from 1808 to 1811 are as irregular as this first ledger suggests." He was quiet for a moment. "I had estimated 2 weeks. Then you'll have time to spare," she said. Another pause. "Coffee's ready," he said, "if you want to start after." She looked up at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and he was watching her with that direct, uncomplicated attention that she still had not entirely learned to receive without some internal readjustment. Like her whole life, she had been standing in rooms where people looked through her, or past her, or at a version of her they had constructed from their own assumptions. And now someone was simply looking at her, the actual her. And the muscles she had developed to brace against being overlooked did not quite know what to do when there was nothing to brace against. "Coffee," she said. "Yes. Thank you." They drank coffee at the kitchen table, which was not where she had expected to drink coffee. She had expected the formal sitting room, the appropriate social distance of a professional arrangement, but the kitchen was where the coffee was. And Callum Ashworth appeared to be a man who went where the practical thing was, rather than where propriety suggested he ought to be. His housekeeper, a broad, practical woman named Mrs. Gable, who looked at Margaret with the frank evaluating gaze of a woman who has been managing a household long enough to assess new arrivals quickly and accurately, poured the coffee and set out a plate of biscuits, and left without comment. "How long has Mrs. Gable been with the estate?" Margaret asked. 19 years, Callum said. "She was here when my father was alive." She looked at me like she was deciding something. "She was," he said. "She decides about everyone who comes through that door." And he looked at her. "She set out the good biscuits," he said. "That's her verdict." Margaret looked down at the biscuits on the plate, and something in her chest did a small involuntary thing that she chose not to examine too closely. They talked about the records for a while, the scope of the reorganization, the system she intended to implement, the questions she would need answered as she went. He was engaged and specific, and did not once treat her expertise as something that required his validation before it could be trusted. And then, in the way that conversations sometimes shift when 2 people have been talking practically for long enough that the practical runs out before the talking does, the subject changed. "You said you've been managing your family's land matters for 3 years," he said. "What did you do before that?" She considered the question. "I taught," she said, "for 6 years. A small school in the county. Reading, arithmetic, some history. The families who could not afford the academy in town." "Why did you stop?" "My father's health declined," she said. "I was needed at home." She said it without bitterness. But she heard the weight of it, even as she said it, the particular weight of a life redirected by someone else's need. And she paused. There was some feeling in the county that a woman of my age, unmarried, teaching children, it was beginning to be remarked upon. That perhaps I was making myself too settled in a role that implied I had given up on other prospects. Other prospects, he repeated. His voice was carefully neutral. Marriage, she said plainly. That is what they meant. That by choosing to be useful, I was signaling that I had accepted a diminished life. And that this reflected poorly on my family, and on the families who sent their children to me. She paused. I disagreed with that assessment. But I was tired of fighting it, and my father needed me. And so I left the school. He was quiet for a long moment. Do you miss it? He asked, the teaching. She looked at her coffee cup. Every day, she said quietly. Something in his expression shifted, something she would not have caught if she had not been watching him with the careful attention she brought to everything. It was not pity. It was something older and more personal than pity. I am sorry, he said, the other kind, just as she had said it. She looked up at him. Yes, she said, I know you are. She came back on Thursday and Friday and the following Monday and Tuesday. The work was as absorbing as she had predicted. And by the end of the second day, she had established a system that was clear enough that she could explain it to anyone who came after her. And by the end of the fourth day, she had reduced 3 incompatible record systems into one coherent ledger that told the story of the Ashworth estate's land management across 20 years in language that any competent person could follow. Callum reviewed her work on Tuesday afternoon, sitting across the table from her with the ledger open between them. And he went through it page by page, with the focused attention of a man who was not simply formative, but actually checking her work, which she respected more than effusive praise. Because it meant he took her seriously enough to verify rather than simply to thank. This he stopped, set the ledger down, looked at her. This is excellent work, Miss Calloway. It's straightforward work, she said. Given time and the right system. I have had 2 professional men of business review those records in the last 2 years, he said. Neither of them produced anything resembling this. She met his gaze. How much did you pay them? He named a figure. Pay me half that, she said. And I'll come back in 6 months to update the current year's entries. He looked at her steadily for a moment. I'll pay you the same amount, he said. Don't negotiate yourself down. The words hit her somewhere unexpected. Don't negotiate yourself down. She had been doing it her whole life. Asking for less than the work was worth because asking for what it was actually worth felt presumptuous. Felt like claiming a value that someone else had to confer before it was real. She had been so thoroughly trained in the art of asking for less that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. He had noticed in approximately 3 seconds. All right, she said. The full amount. Good, he said, and closed the ledger. It was Mrs. Gable who told her. Margaret had been in the records room alone. Callum had ridden out to the north field after lunch to check on a fencing problem, and Mrs. Gable brought her a cup of afternoon tea, with the purposeful air of a woman who had decided that the tea was secondary. She set the cup down, and then she stood with her hands folded in front of her and looked at Margaret with that same frank, evaluating gaze. You're good for him, she said. Margaret looked up from the ledger. I beg your pardon? Mr. Ashworth, Mrs. Gable said. In the tone of a woman who does not repeat herself, but will be patient about it this once. You're good for him. She paused, choosing words with the care of someone who loves a person and is selective about what she reveals of that love to outsiders. He has been very alone since Mrs. Ashworth passed. Not just the ordinary alone. The kind where a person stops expecting anything good to happen and starts just enduring. Going through the motions. She looked at Margaret steadily. He is not doing that this week. Margaret did not know what to say. Mrs. Gable, I'm not telling you to do anything, Mrs. Gable said firmly. I'm telling you what I see. Because I have been in this house for 19 years, and I know the difference between a man who is alive and a man who is merely present. And this week he is alive. She picked up the empty cup that had been sitting on the corner of the table and stripped the corner of the ledger, with the decisive movements of a woman who has said what she came to say. "Drink your tea before it gets cold." She left. Margaret sat with her tea and the weight of what had just been said to her. And she looked at the ledger in front of her, the ordered columns. The clean lines, the years of someone else's life, arranged into coherence by her hands, and she thought about what it meant to be the person who made things make sense for other people, to be the organizing force that everyone relied on and no one quite saw. She thought about a man who was alive this week. She thought about herself. She drank her tea. The twist came on Friday of the following week, and it came, as the worst things often do, from a direction she was not watching. She had been in town. Clara had sent her to collect a dress order from the seamstress, and she was coming out of Mrs. Pruitt's shop, the package under her arm, when she nearly walked directly into Judith Hensley. Judith Hensley was 26, the daughter of the Mrs. Hensley whose gossip had cost Margaret the Hargrove invitation. And she was the kind of beautiful that had never been required to develop anything else. She stood on the boardwalk outside the seamstress's shop with two of her friends. And when she saw Margaret, her expression did the thing that certain people's expressions do, arranged itself into a smile that was not a smile. "Miss Calloway," she said, bright, pleasant, weaponized. "What a coincidence. We were just talking about you." "Were you?" Margaret said. She kept walking. "We were saying," Judith said, and her voice was pitched to carry. Deliberately, in the particular way of a woman who wants witnesses to what she is about to do. That it is remarkable how resourceful some women become when they reach a certain age and realize their options are narrowing. Margaret stopped. She turned around. Judith's smile was at full brightness now, and her two companions wore the expression of people who are very aware that something is happening and do not want to miss it. "I'm not sure what you mean," Margaret said, though she was entirely sure. "I mean," Judith said, "that riding out to Callum Ashworth's estate 4 times in 2 weeks is a very particular kind of resourcefulness. Some people might call it professional. Others might wonder what exactly a woman of your circumstances is offering a wealthy widower in exchange for his ongoing interest." The boardwalk was not crowded. But it was not empty either. There were enough people within earshot to constitute an audience. And they had all gone very still, in the way of people who are pretending not to listen while listening with complete attention. Margaret stood where she was. Every part of her body understood what the correct response was, the measured, dignified response that would preserve her reputation and deny Judith Hensley the satisfaction of a reaction. The part of her that had been practicing survival for 31 years knew exactly what to do. But there was another part of her now, a part that had spent the last 3 weeks being looked at like a whole person by a man who had driven 12 miles to her front door to correct an injustice, and had paid her what her work was worth without being asked, and had listened when she talked about her teaching with the attentive seriousness of someone to whom her losses mattered. That part was done. "What I offer Callum Ashworth," she said, and her voice was clear and even and carried exactly as far as Judith's had, "is competent professional work for fair compensation. I reorganized 20 years of his estate's land records in 4 days. His previous consultants' men, both of them, could not do so in 2 years." She paused. "What I do not offer, Miss Hensley, is the luxury of your boredom. So if you have finished..." "How?" Judith started. "How dare I what?" Margaret said. "Answer you plainly." "I was under the impression that was preferred. You spoke plainly enough. You are..." Judith's bright composure had cracked slightly at the edges. "You are embarrassing yourself. You are a woman alone with no family connections and no prospects, and you..." "Embarrassing myself," Margaret said quietly, "is not the worst thing that has happened to me this summer. Miss Hensley, I have had practice recovering from it." She turned and walked away. Her hands were shaking by the time she turned the corner off the main street, and she pressed them flat against the package she was carrying and breathed through the shaking until it stopped. because she was not going to let her hands shake where anyone could see them. She was halfway back to Clara's house when she heard rapid footsteps behind her. She turned braced. It was not Judith Hensley. It was Thomas Whitfield's wife, Eleanor, a woman Margaret had known distantly for years. A quiet, observant woman whose opinions were carefully kept and rarely shared. She was slightly out of breath from walking quickly, and her expression was one Margaret had not seen on her face before. "Miss Calloway," Eleanor said. "I was there. I heard everything. I know," Margaret said. "I'm sorry if it was—" "Don't apologize," Eleanor said. With a sharpness that surprised them both, she paused, steadied herself. "Don't apologize. What you said was it was right. And what she said was it was wrong, and it has been wrong every time she has said something like it. And I have stopped. I should have said something. The first time. At the Whitfield gathering when Clara she stopped again. I should have said something then, and I did not. Because it is easier not to, and I have been uncomfortable with that ever since." Margaret looked at her. "I'm going to speak to the women I know," Eleanor said, "about what was said today and what was said before, and what the truth of your arrangement with Mr. Ashworth actually is. I cannot undo all of it, but I can do something. If you will allow me." "You do not need my permission to tell the truth," Margaret said. "No," Eleanor said, "but I wanted you to know I was going to do it." She paused. "Because you deserve to know that someone is in your corner." Margaret stood on the road in the August heat, holding a dress package and looking at a woman she barely knew who had just offered her something she had not realized she had been waiting for. Not rescue, not pity, not the charity of someone who felt guilty for their silence. Just the simple, solid knowledge that she was not entirely alone in this. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor said, with the brisk practicality of a woman who has decided to do something and is already 3 steps into doing it. "Wait until it works." She did not tell Callum what had happened on the boardwalk. She told herself she did not tell him because it was not relevant, because the matter had been handled, because Eleanor Whitfield was managing the fallout, because involving him further would only provide more material for the story that Judith Hensley was already telling. She told herself this, and she almost believed it. And then she arrived at the estate on Monday morning for a final review of the completed ledger, and he opened the door himself instead of waiting for Mrs. Gable to do it, and he looked at her face for approximately 3 seconds and said, "What happened?" She opened her mouth to say nothing, and what came out instead was the whole story of the boardwalk. Judith Hensley, the audience, what was said. She told it plainly and without dramatics, standing in his front hallway with her satchel still over her shoulder. And she watched his face while she talked. His expression did not shift dramatically. He was not a man given to dramatic expression, but something in it went very still and very focused in a way that she recognized now as the particular quality of his attention when something had made him genuinely angry, not the hot, impulsive anger that made noise, but the colder, more settled kind that moves toward resolution rather than away from it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Judith Hensley," he said. "Her mother started the first round of talk," Margaret said. "After the Creek meeting." "I know," he said. "I handled that conversation." "I know you did." "Apparently, I did, and handle it sufficiently." "Callum," the name came out before she had decided to use it. And they both registered the fact of it at the same moment, the shift from Mr. Ashworth to his given name, the crossing of a line that had been there, formal and acknowledged, and was now less clearly there than it had been. He did not remark on it. "I am going to speak to her father," he said. "James Hensley and I have business enough that a conversation will not seem out of place. I intend to make it clear that his daughter's continued commentary on your reputation is not something I am willing to overlook." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. And his voice was very quiet and very certain. She looked at him. "Why?" she said. And this time she said it not the way she had said it on her doorstep, with the guarded skepticism of a woman who had been disappointed enough to check her hope at the door, but with the genuine, searching directness of a woman who actually wanted the answer and was prepared, for the first time in a long while, to hear it. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him, deciding something, could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of things that needed to be weighed. Because he said slowly, "You are the most capable, honest, and clear-sighted person I have met in this county in the 15 years I have lived here. Because you did work in 4 days that 2 trained professionals could not do in 2 years, and you did not ask for credit for it, and you asked for less money than it was worth. Because you stood on a boardwalk in front of an audience and told the truth with your hands steady and your voice level, and you did not cry." He paused. "And because I would very much like the opportunity to know you further. And that is not possible while Judith Hensley is running commentary on your character from the dry goods store to the seamstress's shop." The hallway was very quiet. Margaret stood in it and felt the full weight of what had just been said to her, felt it land and settle and stay. She was 31 years old. She had been the woman nobody was coming for. She had learned to be useful in the absence of being wanted, to be competent in the absence of being chosen, to stand steady in the absence of anyone standing beside her. She did not know entirely what to do with this, that is. She started. "Too much," he said. "I know." "No," she said quickly. "Not too much." She stopped. "Breathe, just more than I was prepared for." He waited. She looked at him steadily, the way she had looked at things her whole life when she needed to understand them directly, without flinching, with the full attention of a person who takes the world seriously and has never learned to look away from it. "I would like that too," she said. "The opportunity to be known further." Something in him eased. Not dramatically, he was not a man who did things dramatically. But the stillness in him shifted quality, the way the stillness of a room shifts when someone opens a window. "Good," he said. "That's good." "Yes," she said. They stood in the hallway for another moment. "The ledger is ready for your review," she said. "I know," he said. "We should probably first," he said. "Coffee first," she agreed. And they went toward the kitchen, and Mrs. Gable was already there. And on the table were the good biscuits without anyone asking for them. And the August morning was hot and bright and full of something Margaret did not have a word for yet, but recognized the way you recognize a place you have not been to, but somehow already know. The letter arrived on Thursday. It was addressed to Margaret at Clara's house, and it was not from Callum Ashworth. It was from a man named Gerald Price, a solicitor she had never heard of, representing a man she had heard of, her father's elder brother, Augustin Calloway, who had been living in Philadelphia for 20 years, and who had, in that time, maintained minimal contact with the Virginia branch of the family, and had certainly never shown any interest in the northeast parcel of land that had been her mother's family's for 40 years. The letter was polite. It was precise. It was 11 paragraphs of careful legal language that arrived. By the 11th paragraph, at a single clear point, Augustin Calloway was claiming that the northeast parcel, the same parcel Margaret had just defended against the Ashworth estate's encroachment, the same land she had walked and surveyed and documented, had been transferred to him in a private agreement with her father in 1809. He had documentation, the letter said. He was prepared to pursue the matter through the county court if necessary. He preferred a private settlement. The private settlement he was proposing was this. Margaret and Clara would sign over their claim to the land in exchange for a sum of money that was, by Margaret's immediate mental calculation, approximately 1/3 of the parcel's actual value. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it with hands that were completely steady, placed it inside the survey documents folder she kept in her satchel, went to the sitting room and sat down. Clara found her there 10 minutes later. "Margaret? You look—" She stopped. "What is it? What's happened?" Margaret looked at her sister. "We have a problem," she said. Clara sat down. Margaret told her. The color left Clara's face in stages, first the easy social flush she always carried, then the underlying warmth beneath it, until she was pale in a way that Margaret had not seen since their mother died. "He cannot do this," Clara said. "He believes he can," Margaret said. "And if he has the documentation he claims to have, Father would never have signed anything like that. Father," Margaret said carefully, "was not well in 1809. He was not well and he was frightened, and there were debts from the bad harvest year. And Augustine Calloway has money and a solicitor in Philadelphia, and we've stopped." "What do we have?" Clara asked, and her voice was very small. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "The 1,798 survey records," she said slowly, thinking aloud. "The original land grant documentation. The family history that establishes Mama's family's uninterrupted claim back 40 years. She paused. "And I have reorganized Callum Ashworth's records. Which means I understand exactly how land claims in this county work and what documentation holds in court and what doesn't." Clara stared at her. "Callum Ashworth," she said quietly. "I am not going to ask him to fight this for us," Margaret said immediately. "That is not—" "I know," Clara said. "I know that's not what you meant." She paused. "But Margaret, he knows the county. He knows the legal landscape. He knows the right people." "I know the right people too," Margaret said quietly. "Eleanor Whitfield. Her husband Thomas has been on the county commission for 6 years. Clara blinked. "You have been paying attention," she said. "I have always been paying attention," Margaret said. "I just finally have people paying attention back." She stood up. "I need to write 3 letters," she said. "Tonight. And tomorrow I am going to go back through every document in Father's cedar box. And I am going to find whatever Augustine Calloway thinks he has. And I am going to understand it well enough to take it apart." Clara stood too. And there was something in her face that Margaret had not seen there in a very long time, something that was not the social performance. Not the bright deflecting surface, but the actual woman underneath it all. The woman who had grown up in the same house and lost the same mother and been afraid of the same things. "Tell me what to do," Clara said. "I want to help." Margaret looked at her sister. "Get Father's cedar box from the upstairs cupboard," she said. "And tell Mrs. Porter we'll need more candles. We're going to be up late." Clara nodded and went. And Margaret sat down at the writing desk and pulled out 3 sheets of paper and unstopped the ink and began to write. And the night settled in around her, and outside the Virginia summer had finally begun to cool toward autumn. And somewhere in the cooling air was the particular smell of things changing, the green going gold. The heat beginning its long surrender. She wrote steadily. She was not afraid. She realized with a clarity that felt like cold water. Exactly the opposite. The cedar box held 23 years of her father's life in paper. Margaret and Clara worked through it together at the kitchen table. Mrs. Porter's extra candles burning down to their stubs while the house settled into the particular quiet of very late night. Edmund had come home to find his wife and sister-in-law surrounded by documents and had, to his considerable credit, said nothing except to ask if they needed more light and then to go get it without being asked twice. That was the thing about Edmund that Margaret had never fully acknowledged. He was not a complicated man. And he was not always a perceptive one, but when something genuinely mattered, he had the good sense to move in the right direction without requiring instructions. She was grateful for it tonight. The documents were organized the way her father had organized everything, not by date, not by category, but by some private internal logic that had made complete sense to him and required translation for anyone else. Margaret had learned that logic years ago, and she moved through the box now with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent a decade interpreting another person's system of meaning. Clara handed her papers, Margaret sorted, Edmund refilled the candles. It was midnight when she found it. It was a single sheet, folded twice, tucked inside a larger envelope that contained harvest records from 1809. The handwriting was her father's. She knew it as well as her own, and the date at the top was April 14th, 1809. She read it once. She read it again. Clara asked. She had been watching Margaret's face. Margaret set the paper down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something that might be fragile. And she pressed her fingertips flat against it for a moment before she spoke. "It is a letter from Father to Augustine," she said. "Written in April 1809. What does it say?" Margaret looked at her sister. "It says that Father is refusing to sign any agreement transferring the northeast parcel. It says that the land belongs to the Calloway family by right of mother's inheritance and that no debt, however pressing, justifies signing it away." She paused. "He writes that Augustine came to him with a proposal that if Father signed the land over, Augustine would settle the outstanding harvest debts." Father stared at her. "He refused," Clara said. "He refused," Margaret confirmed. "Which means that whatever document Augustine Calloway is claiming Father signed, either Father signed it under circumstances we do not yet understand, or the document is not what Augustine says it is." The kitchen was very still. "Forged," Edmund said quietly. He had not spoken in over an hour, but the word landed with the flat certainty of a man who had arrived at the only remaining conclusion. "I don't know that yet," Margaret said, "but I intend to find out." She folded her father's letter and placed it in her satchel with the care of someone handling evidence, because that was exactly what it was. "I need to speak to Callum," she said. Clara looked at her, not with the pointed, loaded look she might have deployed a month ago, just directly. As a woman looking at her sister who needs something and is figuring out how to get it. "In the morning," Clara said. "You'll go in the morning?" "Yes," Margaret said. In the morning. She did not sleep. She was at the Ashworth estate before 8 o'clock, which was earlier than she had ever arrived, and early enough that Mrs. Gable opened the door with the expression of a woman who has been up for hours and finds early arrivals entirely reasonable, which told Margaret something about how this household operated. "He's in the records room," Mrs. Gable said, and stepped aside without further preamble. Callum was standing at the table when she came in, standing, not sitting, which meant he had been there long enough to think, and had been moving around the way people move where thoughts are too large for sitting still. He turned when he heard her, and his expression went through a rapid sequence that she caught in pieces: the initial response to seeing her, which was something uncomplicated and warm, and then the secondary response to her face, which was the same focused stillness she had seen before, when something had made him genuinely concerned. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Sit down," he said. I don't need coffee," she said. "I need you to look at something." She put the satchel on the table and opened it, and laid out 3 documents in the order that told the clearest story: her father's 1809 letter, the original land grant, and Gerald Price's letter from Augustine Calloway. She walked him through it without commentary, letting the documents speak first. And then she told him the conclusion she had arrived at in the long, sleepless hours of the night. He listened without interrupting. This was another thing she had come to understand about him: he did not interrupt. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that the time to speak was after he had heard everything there was to hear. And he had the patience to wait for that moment. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the 3 documents. "Your father's letter," he said. "Written in April 1809. Refusing to sign." "Yes." "And Augustine's claim a signed agreement from what year?" "The letter doesn't specify. It says documentation. It does not say when it was supposedly executed." "That's deliberate," Callum said. "If they had a clean document with a clear date, they would have named it. They're leaving room to maneuver." He looked at her. "Who in this county has access to documents that would allow someone to fabricate a convincing land transfer agreement?" She had thought about this in the night. "The county clerk's office," she said. "They keep the form templates for standard agreements." If someone had access to a blank form and a sample of my father's signature from any existing document, how many people have regular access to the clerk's office, the clerk himself, his 2 assistants? She paused. And any attorney in regular practice in the county. They looked at each other. James Hensley, Margaret said quietly, trained as an attorney before he went into land speculation. The name sat between them with a particular weight. Callum's jaw tightened just slightly. You think the Hensley family is involved? I think it is worth asking why Augustine Calloway, who has shown no interest in Virginia land for 20 years, suddenly produces a legal claim against the northeast parcel within weeks of his niece successfully defending that parcel against the Ashworth estate's encroachment, Margaret said. Someone told him the parcel had value worth claiming. Someone who knew what I had found and what it meant. Judith Hensley, Callum said. His voice was very quiet. Her father, Margaret said. Judith talks, James Hensley acts. He straightened. Looked at her with that direct, serious attention. This is a serious accusation, Margaret. It was the first time he had used her given name. Neither of them remarked on it. I know, she said. Which is why I am not making it publicly. I am making it to you. Here, so that we can determine whether it is accurate before anyone else hears it. He nodded slowly. What do you need? Access to the county commission's land records for 1,809, she said. Thomas Whitfield sits on the commission, and Eleanor has already indicated she is. I'll speak to Thomas directly, Callum said. Today. He and I have enough history that he'll give me an hour. He paused. I also want to write to a solicitor I trust in Richmond. Not County Richmond. Someone outside the local network. Yes, she said immediately. That's good. That's very good. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was not quite the surface of his face, but was something underneath it. Something that had to do with the particular and specific fact of her being here. In this room, across this table. You came here first, he said. Yes, before Edmund, before the Whitfields. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. Why? She had known he would ask this. She had thought about the answer in the sleepless dark. Turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath. Because, she said carefully, you are the person I trust most to think about this clearly, without letting what you want the answer to be determine what answer you find. She paused. And because? He said quietly. Because you are the person I wanted to tell, she said. When something happens, good or bad, you are the person I find myself wanting to tell. And I have not had that in a very long time, and I am not entirely sure what to do with it. But I know it is true. The room was quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. And the expression on his face was the one she had never quite seen on any other face before, the one that was not assessment, and was not performance, and was not the careful management of an impression. It was just him looking at her. Seeing her, I reckon, he said quietly. That is about the most important thing anyone has said to me in 4 years. She held his gaze. Then we are even, she said, because what you said to me in this hallway yesterday was the most important thing anyone has said to me in considerably longer than that. Thomas Whitfield received Callum at 10 o'clock and produced the 1,809 county commission records by noon. Margaret was waiting in Eleanor Whitfield's sitting room when Callum came back. Because Eleanor had insisted she come and wait there rather than in the records room at the Ashworth estate. On the grounds that proper procedure mattered, and Margaret's reputation was not going to survive another round of fixed about solitary visits to a wealthy widower's estate. Margaret had accepted the practicality of this without argument. Because Eleanor Whitfield had become in the past 2 weeks something she had not expected, a genuine ally. The kind who did not need to be managed or carefully positioned or protected from the full truth of the situation. Eleanor simply took in information, assessed it accurately, and acted accordingly. And Margaret found this quality so restful after years of navigating around people's more fragile constructions of reality that she had difficulty expressing the full depth of her gratitude for it. Callum came in with Thomas Whitfield, and both men sat down, and the four of them arranged themselves around problem with the focused practicality of people who understand that sentiment can come later, and first the problem needs to be solved. There is no land transfer agreement recorded in the county commission records for 1,809, Thomas said. None. Any legitimate transfer of property of that size would require county recording within 90 days of execution. If your uncle is claiming a documented transfer, it was either never properly recorded, which would make it difficult to enforce in court, or it was recorded somewhere else. Philadelphia, Margaret said immediately. Thomas nodded. That was my thought. If someone filed a fraudulent agreement in a Philadelphia court, with a Philadelphia-based solicitor presenting it, it would take time for the Virginia county to contest the jurisdiction. That's the strategy, Callum said. He was looking at the documents spread on Eleanor's tea table, and his voice had the crisp, hard edge of a man who has seen the shape of something and doesn't like what he's seeing. They file in Philadelphia, where the records are less accessible and the local judges have less familiarity with Virginia land law. They offer a low settlement, and they're counting on you not having the resources to fight it across 2 states, which, Margaret said steadily, we do not, as they are well aware. The room was very quiet for a moment. You do now, Callum said. She looked at him. I have a solicitor in Richmond who handles interstate land disputes, he said. I am going to write to him today. He will review the documentation Augustine's man is claiming exists before we respond to that letter. And if that documentation is what I think it is, he paused, we'll know what we're dealing with. This could take months, Margaret said. Yes, and while it is pending, the land is still yours, Thomas Whitfield said firmly. No transfer of title can proceed while the claim is under active dispute and properly contested. We file a counter notice with the county commission this week. I'll see to it personally. Margaret looked at Thomas Whitfield, who she had known by name and reputation for years, but had never sat in a room with as a person being treated like someone whose problem deserved the full weight of his attention. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Thomas said. And the echo of Eleanor's words in his was clearly not an accident. Wait until it works. The second twist came 11 days later, and it did not arrive from Philadelphia. It arrived in the form of Gerald Price himself, Augustine Calloway's solicitor, who appeared in Harlowe County on a Tuesday morning, and, apparently not knowing the shape of what he was walking into, went directly to the county clerk's office to inquire about the recording process for an interstate land transfer. The county clerk, who had been informed by Thomas Whitfield the previous week that this inquiry might come, sent a message immediately to Margaret. She was at Eleanor's house when the message arrived. She read it once, stood up and said to Eleanor, "He's here." Eleanor stood up with her. "I'm coming. I am coming," Eleanor said, in the tone of a woman who does not say things she does not mean. "You are not walking into that room alone." They went to the county clerk's office together, walking side by side down the main street of Harlowe at the brisk, purposeful pace of 2 women who have decided that something is going to happen, and they intend to be there when it does. Gerald Price was a compact man in his 50s with the careful, well-maintained appearance of a professional who understood the importance of impressions. He was standing at the clerk's counter when they came in, and he turned at the sound of the door, and his eyes moved over Margaret with the quick evaluating look of a man who knows exactly who he has just encountered. "Miss Calloway," he said, carefully pleasant. "It isn't one," Margaret said. "You've been expected." His pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it recalibrated. "I see. Then perhaps we should," she agreed. "I'd like to know the date on the document you're claiming my father signed." A pause. "I'm not at liberty to March 3rd, 1809, she said. "Is that the date?" He blinked. She had guessed. It was an educated guess, the date of the worst point of the 1809 debt crisis. the date when her father's financial records showed the most pressure. The date that someone constructing a convincing false document would most likely choose because it was the date when a desperate man might believably have signed something he shouldn't have. But it had been a guess. The fact that Gerald Price's expression shifted told her everything. "I see you're familiar with the timeline," he said carefully. "I'm familiar with my father's letter of April 14th. 1809, she said, in which he describes refusing to sign your client's proposal in explicit terms. A letter dated 6 weeks after the date I believe your document bears." She held his gaze. "A letter that has been reviewed by Thomas Whitfield and by a solicitor in Richmond who specializes in interstate land disputes." Gerald Price was quiet. "My client," he said finally, "may be open to a conversation about the terms." "Your client," Margaret said, "attempted to take land that has been in my mother's family for 40 years, using a document that I believe is fraudulent. And he did so at a moment calculated to coincide with a period when my family was at its most vulnerable and least likely to have the resources to contest it." She paused. "I am not interested in terms. I am interested in withdrawal. Complete and uncontested withdrawal of the claim, with a written statement from your client that he has no interest in the Northeast parcel and no valid legal claim to it." "Miss Calloway." "You cannot simply—" "She can," said a voice from the doorway. They both turned. Callum Ashworth was standing in the doorway of the county clerk's office. He was not wearing his riding coat, which meant he had come directly from something else, and had not stopped to present himself as anything other than what he was: a man who had been told something was happening and had come. He stepped inside, and his presence did the thing it always did: the reorganizing of the available space, and his eyes went to Margaret first, just for a moment, just to confirm she was all right, and then to Gerald Price. "Callum Ashworth," he said. He did not offer his hand. "My solicitor in Richmond has been in contact with the Philadelphia court regarding the recording of your client's claimed agreement. I expect within the week he'll have confirmation of what the agreement actually is and when it was actually drawn up." He paused. "In the meantime, I've spoken this morning with 3 members of the county commission and 2 attorneys who practice in this district, all of whom are prepared to contest any attempt to transfer title to the Northeast Calloway parcel on the grounds of procedural irregularity." Another pause. "Your client knew the condition of this family's resources when he filed. He chose his timing accordingly. That is not a legal strategy. That is predation. And I intend to make sure everyone who needs to understand that does." Gerald Price looked at Callum for a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret. "I will," he said quietly, "be in contact with my client." He gathered his papers and left. The county clerk, who had been motionless behind his counter for the duration of this exchange, exhaled with the particular sound of a man who has been holding his breath for some time. Eleanor Whitfield touched Margaret's arm briefly, just a touch. Just the warmth of a hand saying, "I am here," and then she stepped back to give Margaret the moment that belonged to her. Margaret looked at Callum. "You came," she said, "Mrs. Gable told me you'd gone to town with Eleanor," he said. "And Thomas sent word that the solicitor had appeared." He paused. "I came." "You didn't, Margaret," he said quietly. She stopped. "I know I didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to. Those are going to continue to be different things, and I'm going to continue to choose wanting to. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me." She looked at him for a long moment. All the careful distance she had maintained, all the precise professional framing she had constructed around what they were to each other, the management of her own hope that she had practiced with such disciplined attention, she could feel it. The weight of it, and she could feel what it had cost her to carry it. And she could feel, with the particular clarity of a woman who has run out of reasons to pretend, that she did not want to carry it anymore. "All right," she said. Just that. But it meant more than that, and they both knew it. The letter from the Richmond solicitor arrived 2 weeks later. It confirmed what Margaret had suspected. The document Augustine Calloway's man had presented bore a date of March 3rd. 1809, but the paper on which it was written had been manufactured no earlier than 1811. The solicitor had compared the document against two other agreements drawn up by the same Philadelphia notary in 1809 and found significant discrepancies in the notary's seal and signature. The document was a fabrication. Callum read her the letter sitting across from her at his kitchen table, the same kitchen table where they had drunk coffee on her first day, where Mrs. Gable had put out the good biscuits, where something had begun its slow and steady claiming of the territory she had kept defended for so long. When he finished reading, she was quiet for a moment. Then she put her face in her hands, not crying, just pressing her palms against her eyes and breathing, feeling the full weight of the last 3 weeks move through her and out the other side. "It's over," he said quietly. She agreed. From behind her hands, "You did that," he said. "You found your father's letter. You recognized the strategy. You walked into that clerk's office and you named the date, and you watched his face and you knew." He paused. "You did all of that." She lowered her hands, looked at him. "I had help," she said. "You had people who showed up," he said. "Because you gave them something worth showing up for." She looked at him across the table. This man she had known for 5 weeks. This man who had looked at her on a Whitfield lawn and decided that what he saw was worth the trouble of looking closer. This man who had driven to her door and stood on her step with his hat in his hands and had paid her what her work was worth and had come to a county clerk's office in the middle of a Tuesday morning because she was there and something was happening. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "That first day," she said, "at the Whitfield gathering. Before the creek, before the land dispute, before any of it. You looked at me." She held his gaze. "Why? Out of everyone in that room, you looked at me, and not the way people usually looked at me." "So why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because," he said, "everyone else in that room was performing something. Performing grace, or performing importance, or performing happiness, or performing contentment. And you," he paused, "you were just standing there, being exactly where you were, exactly who you were, without performing a single thing." He looked at her steadily. "I had forgotten that was possible. I reckon I needed the reminder." She thought about Clara. "On the morning of the gathering, you are an embarrassment. 31 years old and nobody is coming for you." And she thought about herself standing in that hallway, with her heart hammering and her hands steady. And she thought about all the years she had spent standing in rooms full of people and feeling the particular loneliness of invisibility. She thought about what it meant to be seen. "Callum," she said. "Yes, I am not going to be easy to know," she said. "I have opinions and I express them, and I do not manage them down to make other people comfortable. I have been told my entire life that this is a liability, and I no longer believe that it is, but I want you to understand it before." She stopped. "Before whatever this is continues in the direction it appears to be going." He looked at her with that direct, uncomplicated attention. "Margaret," he said, "I have been running an estate alone for 4 years because I could not find a single person in this county willing to simply be honest with me." He paused. "I don't need easy. I need true," she breathed. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We do," he said. Outside, the Virginia summer was moving toward September, the heat finally beginning its slow concession to something cooler and clearer. And the morning light was the particular quality of light that comes when a season has decided it is ready to change. "There is one more thing," Margaret said. He waited. "I am going to reopen the school," she said. "Not ask permission from anyone to do it. Not wait for it to be acceptable. I am going to find a space, and I am going to teach the children in this county who cannot afford the academy. And I am going to do it as myself, under my own name. And I am not going to apologize for it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I have a building on the east edge of my property," he said. "It's been empty for 2 years. It's sound and it's dry and it has good light from the south windows." He paused. "It's yours if you want it." She stared at him. "I'm not giving it to you," he said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. It's not charity, and I'm not trying to own what you build. It's a building. It's sitting empty, use it. She understood the distinction. She was discovering, the distinction he always made between giving someone something and simply removing an obstacle that had no good reason to be there. I'll pay rent, she said. You'll pay whatever you think it's worth, he said. Then we'll negotiate, she said. Something crossed his face that she had come to recognize now, that brief, genuine, slightly unpracticed smile that he kept like something precious and rare. Yes, ma'am. I reckon we will. And she smiled back at him. And the morning was clear, and the season was turning. And the school was not yet built, and the fight was not yet entirely finished, and the thing between them was still careful and new, and had not been spoken aloud in the words that would make it permanent, but it was there. Solid and real and not going anywhere, and Margaret Calloway, who had been told her whole life that nobody was coming for her, sat at a kitchen table in the full light of a September morning and let herself, completely and without apology, feel the truth of where she was. She was exactly where she was, and she was not alone. The school opened on the first Monday of October. Margaret had spent 3 weeks preparing it, not just the building, which Callum's men had cleaned and repaired and fitted with proper shelving along the south wall, but the curriculum, the supply list, the letters she wrote to every family in the county she knew, had children who could not afford the academy fees. She wrote those letters herself, by hand, at Clara's writing desk, late in the evenings after the household had gone quiet. And she wrote them without apology and without the careful hedging language she had once used to make it herself smaller and easier to dismiss. She wrote them as a teacher, because that was what she was. That was what she had always been, and she was done pretending otherwise. 11 children came on the first day. By the end of the second week, there were 17. She taught them reading and arithmetic and a little history. The same things she had taught before, but this time she taught them in a building that was hers, not given to her. Not charity, but negotiated fairly and paid for with her own earnings from work she had done well and been compensated honestly for. She taught them with the particular energy of a woman who has been doing the right thing in the wrong conditions for years and has finally, improbably, found the right conditions. Mrs. Gable came on the third Friday with a basket of food for the children's midday meal, appeared at the door without announcement, set the basket down on the table inside and said, "From Mr. Ashworth," he said, "don't make a fuss about it." Then she left before Margaret could say anything at all. Margaret stood there for a moment, looking at the basket. Then she made a fuss about it anyway, privately, in the way of a woman who has learned that some feelings do not need an audience to be real. Clara came to see the school on a Thursday afternoon in the third week, arriving unannounced in the way that sisters do, and she stood in the doorway while Margaret finished a reading lesson with the older children and watched with an expression that Margaret did not see until she turned around. It was not the expression Clara usually wore. It was not the bright performing surface or the careful management of a woman who is always slightly anxious about how things appear. It was something underneath all of that, something plain and real and a little undone. "You're good at this," Clara said, when the children had gone out for their midday break. "I know," Margaret said. She said it simply, without apology. "I have always been good at this." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I know that too," she said. I don't think I ever said it." "No," Margaret agreed. "You didn't." The word sat between them, not accusatory, just honest. Just the fact of it, laid plain. Clara crossed the room and sat down in one of the children's chairs, which was slightly too small for her, and she sat in it anyway, with the dignity of a woman who has decided that the conversation matters more than appearances. "I said terrible things to you," she said. "Not just the morning of the Whitfield gathering. I have said terrible things to you for years, Margaret. I said them in front of people. I said them like they were true. Some of them you believed were true," Margaret said. "That doesn't make it better." "No," Margaret said. "It doesn't." Clara was afraid, she said. And her voice was very quiet, stripped down to the thing underneath the thing. I know that is not a good enough reason. But I was afraid that if you stayed unmarried, if you stayed as you were, people would look at our family and see something wrong. Something that reflected on me, on Edmund, on my children. She stopped. I made your life smaller because I was afraid of what your life said about mine. And that his voice broke just slightly at the edges. That is one of the worst things I have ever done. Margaret looked at her sister. She had imagined this conversation in various forms. For years. In some of those imagined versions, she had been cold and precise and had laid out every specific injury with the careful documentation of a woman who keeps accurate records. In others she had cried, which she had always considered a kind of defeat. She did neither. She pulled one of the children's chairs close to her sister's and sat down in it and took Clara's hands in hers. And she held them the way you hold the hands of someone you have loved for your entire life. Someone whose failures are inseparable from your own history because they are your history. The whole complicated living mess of it. You are not the only person in this county who made my life smaller, she said. You are just the one whose opinion I cared most about. She paused. Which is why it hurt most. Not because you were the worst of them. Because you were mine. Clara's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and did not let herself cry in the way of a woman who has been not crying in public for so long it has become instinct. I'm sorry, she said. I am so sorry, Margaret. I know, Margaret said. I know you are. She held her sister's hands, and outside the Virginia October was bright and sharp, and the children were making noise in the yard. And the building was real and solid around them, and Margaret Calloway, who had learned to need very little, because very little had been offered, sat with her sister and let the apology land the way it needed to land, not quickly. Not with the easy absolution that makes people feel better, without actually reckoning with what they've done. But slowly, with the full weight of its meaning. I need you to be different, Margaret said finally. Not perfect. I am not asking for perfect. But different, I know, Clara said. I need you to stop. Found the words. When someone says something diminishing about me, I need you to not laugh. I need you to not join in. Even when it's easier. Even when the room expects it. Yes, Clara said. Immediately, without qualification. Yes, I will. And I need you to let me be who I am, Margaret said. All of it. The part that is too much, and the part that thinks 3 steps ahead, and the part that negotiates, and the part that does not apologize for knowing things. I need you to let that woman be your sister, without treating her like a problem. Clara tightened her grip on Margaret's hands. She already is my sister, she said. She has always been my sister. It took me too long to be proud of that. The room was quiet. Then Clara straightened, and something shifted back into her, not the performing surface, but something more solid than that, the core of her that was genuinely her sister. The woman who had grown up in the same house and loved the same parents and knew all the same silences. Now, Clara said, with the brisk practicality of a woman who has decided that the emotional part is finished for the moment and there is work to be done. Are you going to tell me what is happening with Callum Ashworth? Or are you going to make me ask Edmund to find out? Margaret looked at her. Despite everything, despite the weight of the last several minutes, despite the rearranging of old things that had needed rearranging for years, something in her chest did a small, involuntary, entirely undignified thing. There is nothing to tell, she said. Yet. Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman who has known her sister for 31 years and is not remotely deceived. Yet, she said. Yet, Margaret confirmed, and Clara smiled, the real one. The one that did not perform anything, and for the first time in longer than either of them, could have said precisely. Margaret smiled back. The conversation with Callum happened on a Saturday evening in late October. And it happened the way most important things between them happened, without ceremony. Without the elaborate social scaffolding that people construct when they are about to say something significant, because the scaffolding makes them feel less exposed. It happened plainly, the way plain things do, because they were both people who had run out of patience for anything else. He had come to the school to drop off a second load of supplies, chalk and slates that he had ordered from Richmond, which was considerably more than dropping off supplies, and they both knew it. Margaret was alone, the children long gone home, tidying the room for Monday's lesson. She heard him come in and did not turn around immediately, because she was finishing what she was doing, and he waited because he always waited. And the waiting itself was a kind of conversation they had been having for months now, the language of two people who had been broken in particular ways and had rebuilt themselves around the absence of what broke them, and were now, carefully and without rushing, discovering what it meant to stand close to someone again. "I ordered too much chalk," he said. "You ordered exactly the right amount of chalk," she said. Turning, "There will be 23 children by spring. I have 3 more families who have written to ask about enrollment." He set the crate down on the table. 23. 23, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the slates lined up along the south wall. The alphabet she had written in her own hand across the top of the large board he had mounted for her. The reading books stacked in careful order by level. The arithmetic figures one of the older students had left on his slate by mistake on Friday. The careful columns of a child who was just beginning to understand that numbers had patterns. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "You provided the building. I provided a building," he said. "You made it into this. There's a difference." She looked at him. "Callum," she said. "Yes. I have been thinking," she said. "About what you said. In this room the first time you showed it to me. You said the building was mine if I wanted it, and you were not giving it to me, and you were not trying to own what I built." "I remember," he said. "I have been thinking," she said slowly, "about what it means to build something and have it be yours. To stand in a place and be exactly who you are." She paused. "I spent 31 years standing in rooms where I was not fully welcome. And I learned to take up less space. To want less, to expect less." She looked at him steadily. "I am trying to unlearn that. I am trying to want the things I actually want without cutting them down to the size that feels safe." He was watching her with that complete, serious attention. "And what do you want?" he asked. Quietly. The same question Clara had asked months ago on a summer afternoon. But different, utterly, completely different in his mouth. Because he was asking it the way you ask something, when you genuinely need the answer. When the answer matters to you personally and directly, and without any protection from what it might be. She breathed. "I want the school," she said. "I want to teach. I want the northeast parcel to stay in my mother's family, and I want to know that what my father refused to sign away is safe." She paused. "I want to stop being the woman nobody was coming for, and I want to stop needing someone to come for me, and I want—" She stopped. "I want you," she said, "specifically you, not a husband. Not a solution. You, the person who reads land records at 7 in the morning and drinks his coffee without comment and let Mrs. Gable put out the good biscuits and drove 12 miles to correct an injustice that did not require his correction. I want that person in my life in a real and permanent way. And I am terrified of saying so, because I have wanted things before and been Margaret," he said. She stopped. He crossed the room in 3 steps, not rushing. Not dramatically, just moving with the direct, unhesitating certainty of a man who has made up his mind and sees no reason to delay the acting on it, and he took her hands in both of his. His hands were warm and calloused and very certain. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the right moment to say this for approximately 6 weeks. And I have decided there is no right moment. There is only the moment where I stop waiting for the right one and say the thing." She looked up at him. "I love you," he said. Plain as weather. Plain as a boundary line on a survey document. Plain as a man who has decided that the most important things deserve to be said in the simplest possible words. "I have loved you since you stood at that fence at the Whitfield gathering and told me that you meant what you said and would probably regret it. I loved you then, and I have loved you every day since, and I would very much like—" if you are willing, to love you for considerably longer than that." The room was very still. Margaret Calloway, who had learned to want less and expect less, and stand steady in the absence of being chosen, stood in a schoolroom she had built herself, and looked at the man who was holding her hands and saying the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. She did not cry, she did not look away. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to, because I did not want to want something this much." And then she stopped. "But I do. I have. For longer than I have been willing to admit." He tightened his hands around hers. "Then let's stop being careful about it," he said. "Yes," she said. The twist that came next was not a painful one. And perhaps that was why it hit her as hard as it did, because she had armored herself against the painful kind and had left herself entirely undefended against the other sort. It came from Augustine Calloway, not through Gerald Price, not through a solicitor or a legal document or a letter written in the cold, precise language of a man pressing an advantage. It came in his own hand on plain paper, in the cramped and somewhat shaky script of a man who was older than she had imagined him, and perhaps, she thought, more frightened. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after her conversation with Callum in the schoolroom. It was addressed to both Margaret and Clara. It was 4 paragraphs long. In the first paragraph, Augustine Calloway withdrew the land claim entirely and unconditionally. He directed Gerald Price to file the appropriate notice with both the Philadelphia and Harlowe County courts. In the second paragraph, he said that the document he had presented had been prepared by a man he had trusted and had not, to his shame, examined with sufficient rigor before proceeding. He did not name the man, he did not need to. Margaret already knew. In the third paragraph, he said that their father, his brother Robert, had been a better man than he had given him credit for, and that the letter of April 1809, which his solicitor had informed him existed, was entirely consistent with the Robert Calloway he remembered from their boyhood, the one who had always been more interested in doing right than in doing well. The fourth paragraph was only 2 sentences. "I am sorry for the fear I caused your family. Robert's daughters deserved better from his brother than this." Margaret read the letter at the kitchen table, and Clara read it over her shoulder. And when she finished, Clara sat down abruptly in the chair beside her and put her hands over her mouth. "He knew," Clara said softly. "He knew the document was wrong. He suspected," Margaret said carefully. "And he chose not to look too closely. There is a difference." She paused. "But he looked in the end." "Because you made him," Clara said. "Because the evidence made him," Margaret said. "I just made sure the evidence existed somewhere he couldn't ignore it." Clara lowered her hands, looked at her sister. "You are remarkable," she said. "Simply and without performance. Just the fact of it." Margaret looked at her. "I know," she said, and for the first time in her life she said it without irony and without apology, and without the reflexive self-diminishment she had practiced so long it had become automatic. She said it because it was true, and because it was true and she knew it and was willing to say so. It did not sound like arrogance. It sounded like a woman who had finally, after 31 years, caught up to her own worth. James Hensley left Harlowe County in November. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public reckoning, no scene in the main street that the county could talk about for years. Callum had spoken to him in October, a private conversation whose content neither man ever fully reported, and whatever had been said in that conversation had apparently been clear enough in its implications that James Hensley found reasons to relocate his family's business interests to a county some 40 miles north. Judith went with him, of course. The county watched them go with the particular expression of a community that knows something has shifted in the balance of things and is still determining exactly what to make of it. Eleanor Whitfield remarked to Margaret, very quietly, over tea, that the absence of certain presences could improve the quality of a room considerably. Margaret agreed. The proposal, when it came, was nothing like what she might have imagined in the years when she had still allowed herself to imagine such things. It was a December morning, cold and clear, and she had arrived at the estate early because 2 of the harvest ledgers needed updating before the year closed, and she had taken on the Ashworth estate's record management formally now, at her rate, on her terms, as a professional arrangement that everyone in the county knew about, and that no one, in the new configuration of things, found anything worth remarking on. She was working at the table in the records room when he came in and sat down across from her, which he sometimes did when he was thinking through a problem and found that thinking was easier in the presence of someone else working. She kept working. He was quiet for several minutes. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said, without looking up. "Marry me." She looked up. He was watching her with that steady, direct gaze, not performing anything, not arranging himself into the posture of a man making a romantic gesture. Just sitting there, asking the thing, looking at her. "That wasn't a question," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She set her pen down. She thought about a hallway where a hand had come down across her face and a voice had told her nobody was coming. She thought about a fence at the edge of a summer lawn where a man had appeared from nowhere and told her that what she had said had taken courage. She thought about a creek bed and a kitchen table and a boardwalk and a county clerk's office and a schoolroom full of children and her sister's hands in hers and her father's letter folded inside a satchel that had carried all the evidence she needed to win. She thought about who she was. She was Margaret Calloway. She was 31 years old. She was a teacher and a land records manager, and the woman who had unraveled a fraudulent claim in 4 days, and rebuilt 20 years of disorganized documents in 4 more, and reopened a school that had 17, now 23, children in it, and would have more in the spring. She was the woman who had stood in rooms where she was not welcome and carried herself like she belonged there. Because she did belong there. Because belonging was not something other people granted. It was something you knew about yourself and held on to, regardless of what anyone else had decided. She was not a woman who needed saving. She was a woman who had saved herself, piece by piece and year by year, and who was now choosing freely. With full information, with both eyes open and her hands steady to share what she had built, with a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "Yes," she said. Callum exhaled a small, controlled sound. But she caught it, and what it told her was that for all his steadiness, for all the settled certainty he had carried into this room, he had not been entirely sure of the answer, and the note being sure had cost him something. Which meant the answer had mattered to him enormously. Which was exactly right. "The school stays mine," she said. "Always," he said immediately. "The land records work continues as a professional arrangement. Paid at the agreed rate, naturally. And I will not be managed," she said. "Not by you, not by anyone. I will be partnered with. I will be consulted and respected and disagreed with honestly, and told the truth even when it is inconvenient. But I will not be managed." He looked at her with that expression, the real one. The one that was not the surface of his face. "Margaret," he said, "I fell in love with you because you cannot be managed. Why in God's name would I want to start now?" She looked at him. Then she reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his over and held hers with the firm, warm certainty of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and does not intend to let it go. "Then yes," she said again, completely and without reservation. Yes. They were married in the spring, on a day in April when the Virginia countryside was loud with the particular insistence of things coming back to life. The ceremony was small. The Whitfields, Edmund and Clara and the children. Mrs. Gable, who wept with the controlled efficiency of a woman who considers weeping an acceptable activity in clearly defined circumstances. Thomas Whitfield said afterward that he had not seen Callum Ashworth smile that many times in a single afternoon in the 15 years he had known him. Eleanor Whitfield said that Margaret Calloway had been the finest woman in Harlowe County for years, and it had simply taken the county some time to catch up to that fact. Clara held Margaret's hands before the ceremony. in the small room off the side of the church, and looked at her sister in her good dress, not the green one. A new one, deep blue, made by Mrs. Pruitt, who had charged her fairly and without commentary, and said nothing for a long moment. "You look like yourself," Clara said finally. "I know," Margaret said. "I finally do." Clara held on a moment longer. "Mama would have loved him," she said quietly. "She would have loved who you are with him." Margaret pressed her sister's hands once. Hard. "She would have loved who I am without him too," she said. "Yes," Clara said, and her voice was steady and sure and meant every word of it. Yes, she would have. The school grew. By the following autumn it had 31 students. And Margaret had taken on an assistant, a young woman named Ruth. Barely 18, the daughter of a tobacco farmer. Sharp as a new blade, and hungry for something more than the narrow life that had been arranged for her. Margaret recognized the hunger and did not diminish it. She fed it. Callum expanded the building that winter. He did it without being asked. Drawing up the plans himself and presenting them to Margaret one morning at breakfast with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who has identified a problem and arrived at a solution and sees no reason to wait for permission to solve it. She reviewed the plans carefully, made 3 suggestions, all of which he incorporated, and said next spring. Next spring, he agreed. The county had learned by then the shape of how things worked between them. And the county had adjusted itself accordingly, the way communities do when they discover that the story they have been telling about someone was wrong. Not with dramatic admission, but with the quiet, gradual realignment of people who would simply prefer to be on the right side of things in retrospect. Mrs. Hargrove invited Margaret to her supper gatherings regularly now. The invitations were accepted or declined, based entirely on whether Margaret had the time and inclination, which she found to be a deeply satisfying arrangement. Judith Hensley's name came up occasionally in conversation, the way absent people's names do, and Margaret mentioned her neither kindly nor unkindly, simply accurately, which was the most honest kind of mercy she knew how to offer. On the last evening of that October, a year and a half after a summer gathering where a woman in a mended blue dress had stood at a fence and told the truth about herself to a stranger who had come to listen, Margaret sat in the records room of the Ashworth estate, her estate now. Half hers by law and entirely hers in every way that mattered, and she finished the entry in the land management ledger for the week. She closed the ledger. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Callum came in and sat across from her, coffee in hand, which was where he always ended up at the close of the working day, the way 2 people end up in the same place, at the same time, without planning it, because they have built their lives around each other's gravity. "How many students this week?" he asked. 34, she said. "The Mercer family enrolled their youngest on Wednesday." He nodded. "The northeast parcel boundary markers are being reset next Tuesday," he said. "The county surveyor is coming to put the permanent stones in." "Good," she said. They sat in the comfortable, full silence of 2 people who have said all the necessary things and are now simply in the same room, which is its own kind of conversation and its own kind of home. After a while, Margaret said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said. "That morning in the hallway," she said, "when Clara's hand came down and she said nobody was coming for me." She paused. "I think about how certain she was, how certain everyone was, how certain I was beginning to be." He was watching her. And he said quietly, she looked at him, this man. This steady and serious and real man who had stood at a fence and listened and driven 12 miles and stood on doorsteps and walked into county clerks' offices and held her hands in records rooms and said, "I love you," like it was the simplest truth in the world, because to him it was. "And I think," she said, "that the most important thing I ever did was refuse to believe them." She reached across the table. He took her hand without hesitation, the way he always did, without ceremony, without performance, with the complete and settled certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is and has decided that this is where he intends to stay. "The most important thing you ever did," he said, was stay exactly who you were, until someone with sense enough to see you came along. She held his gaze. We stayed who we were, she said. Yes, he said. We did. Outside, the Virginia was going dark and gold, and the school at the edge of the property had its lamps lit for Ruth's evening session with the older students. And the northeast parcel lay quiet and exactly where it had always been, bounded by the old creek and the old stones and 40 years of a family's unbroken claim. And Margaret Calloway Ashworth sat in the warmth of the life she had built, not been given, not rescued into, not handed, and she held the hand of the man who had been brave enough to see her clearly. And she was exactly who she had always been, and that was enough. That was, at last and without question, more than enough.